Hi everybody, welcome to part two of the series on cells. This time we're going to talk about types of cells and one organelle of the cell called the cell membrane, but it's so important that we have to kind of break it off and talk about it on its own. There are two standards that are related to this, and they both have to do with cells. The first one, of course, is to relate the structure of plant and animal cells to each other and explain the role of cell membranes. And then the other one, of course, is to compare and contrast the general structures of plant and animal cells. And we're going to use these two uh, Sunshine State standards for both parts 2 and part 3. Okay, let's take a look at this first idea. Again, cells. This is going to be a little bit of review from the last video. Cells are the basic units of all living things. If it's alive, it has cells. And then, of course, here's a cell theory. Now, you may notice that this cell theory doesn't sound exactly like the last cell theory that I said, because you can rewrite these three parts. It has the same three basic parts, they're just kind of written differently. All organisms are made up of one or more cells. The cell is the basic unit of all organisms, and all cells come from cells, as we reviewed in the last video. If you haven't watched that video yet, please go do it. But this is the basis of the understanding of all things cellular. But when it really comes down to it, this is the beginning of all biological knowledge right here, this cell theory. So please make sure you go back and watch video 1 from this series. Now, there are two types of cells, and it has to do with their structure, which really has to do with their evolutionary history. But a long time ago, the earliest living things on Earth were very simple single-celled organisms called prokaryotes. They're still around today. In fact, there are far more prokaryotes than there are eukaryotes. There are more bacterial cells in you than you have cells of your own. And these are the bacteria, by the way. Now, they're small. They're really small. If a eukaryote is a beach ball, then a bacteria is a BB sitting next to it. It's an unbelievably small structure because it's not that complex. It's very simple. It has a cell membrane, maybe sometimes a cell wall. There's some DNA floating around inside, and a few things like ribosomes and some cytoplasm might have little things on the outside to help it move around called these pili. It might have a tail called a flagellum, but really compared to the eukaryotic structure, this is an incredibly simple structure, which is why it's small. And in fact, the idea of the eukaryotic cell is that it has to be much, much bigger to hold all the parts inside that we're about to talk about in video number 3. Now, so that does lead us to the idea of the eukaryotic cell. The eukaryotic cell is a much bigger cell. It's much more complex. It's able to do much more. And there are single-celled back. There are single-celled eukaryotic cells called protists and a few fungus, but most of them, the plants, all the animals, most of the fungus cells, and some of the protist cells, about half the protist cells, are all multicellular. This complexity is caused, this is how we became more complex. Cells themselves got more complex, and then they started working together to become specialized cells in a larger body. By the way, all prokaryotes are single-celled. There are no multicellular prokaryotes. They're all very simple bacteria, and yeah, they're just little bitty guys, okay? They do have some parts in common that I think are important. Both of these types of cells will have a cell membrane. Both of them will be filled with a thick kind of like runny jello kind of a substance called cytoplasm. They both do have organelles inside of them, although again the prokaryote has very few organelles, whereas the eukaryote is full of organelles. And then they both use DNA. In fact, all living things on Earth use DNA to store their information. And so these are some things that are parts in common. Now, when we talk about the eukaryotes, we're actually going to split that into two parts too. But I'm pretty much done with the prokaryotes right now. They're very small, very simple, have very few parts to them. Just kind of think of them as a basic cell. Now, yeah, and you know what? I've already said that. The DNA is locked inside of the cytoplasm on this little guy. So it does just kind of float around there, but with eukaryotic cells, the DNA is actually stored in a protective structure called the nucleus. So that's another big difference. This thing does not have a nucleus. There's no extra membrane of a nucleus for this stuff to be stored inside. It's just kind of floating around. And in fact, that's what prokaryote means. Karyote means nucleus, so pro means before the nucleus, and eukaryote, EU, means true nucleus. So this was around before there was a nucleus. In fact, the nucleus evolved uh, it to be the eukaryotes. So there are four classes of eukaryotic cells. We're only going to talk about two, the plant and animal cells, because the other two, the fungus and the protist, have all these characteristics. They really look more like animal cells, but you can study everything you need to study by looking at the plant and the animal cells. And in fact, we're going to spend most of our time looking at the animal cell, and then I'll just tell you the parts that are extra for the plant cells, and we really don't mention the fungus or the protist cells anymore. When we do start talking about them, one thing I want you to understand is that in multicellular organisms, each cell has a different job to do, each kind of cell. Remember, you came from a simple single cell that was a result of an egg being fertilized, and that egg, that fertilized egg, that one single cell that was originally you, started to immediately to grow and divide and grow and divide. And after it hit about 45 to 65, less, right around 100 cells, between 50 and 100 cells, they started to specialize. The cells started to change a little bit and become different. We call that differentiation, this word right here. Cell differentiation is how we take one single cell, such as a fertilized egg, and are able to create all the structures in our body. I have skin cells, bone cells, blood cells, top of my head cells, bottom of my foot cells. I have muscle cells, and each one of those I generally have different kinds. There's three kinds of muscle cells. There's numerous types of skin cells. You wouldn't believe the amount of different cells floating around in your blood. And so, as a result, all of those cells came from that original cell, that original fertilized egg that your mother and father contributed to you. And that process is known as differentiation. If these are all three from the same person, the bone cell, the skin cell, and the cardiac muscle cell, which is the muscle in your heart, they all came from that original cell, and they had to change over time. And so that's an important process. And in fact, differentiation is a huge point of study right now, because if we can find cells that are what we call undifferentiated, we're then able to take those cells and grow a whole bunch of them and leave them undifferentiated and say, hey, this guy needs a heart transplant, so we can grab those cells and tell them to become heart cells, and then we can make you a heart, and then replace your old worn out, gobbed up heart with a brand new bouncing baby heart, and then you're starting off to the races again. This is a huge push right now in science for helping people recover from things like damage to their skin. Like if you get a bad burn, we can grow skin cells. If you do have some type of an issue where you've had some damage to your intestines, or uh, organs, or anything, we're getting to the point where we can actually start to produce these cells for you and put them, and help you to recover. That wasn't the point here, but I just wanted to share that with you because cell differentiation is important. And single cell organisms don't go through cell differentiation, but multicellular organisms do. Almost all of them do. There are a few that are just all the same cell, they're just multicellular. But for the most part, that's the advantage of becoming a multicellular organism, is that cells can now specialize. And I want you to think about that. The cardiac muscle doesn't have to be a bone cell. It doesn't have to focus on support. It doesn't have to focus on protection and waterproofing like skin cells do. It can just be a cardiac muscle cell. And the same thing with these other ones. Specialization means that these cells can do they can do one job better than if they try to do all of the jobs. Like a single celled organism has to do all these jobs by themselves with just one cell. And they don't do all these jobs very well, which is why they stay fairly non-complex. But you can become quite a complex organism if you let the cells become differentiated and start doing a single job. And this cell now, it's had one job. It's a cardiac muscle cell. Its job is to be part of your cardiac muscle in your heart, and it doesn't have to do all these other jobs, which means that it can become better. Okay, uh, the next thing we want to talk about, we're going to start talking about the organelles. And one of the most important organelles found in every single cell is the cell membrane. In fact, we're just going to spend some time, quite a bit of time, talking about the cell membrane. The rest of the organelles, they get one slide, but the cell membrane is so important, it's going to get several slides here. Now, follow along because it can get slightly complicated. And remember, I'm going pretty fast on this, but cell membranes are made out of what we call phospholipids. Lipids, if you remember, are long chains of monomers in this case fatty acids, put together to create a very long chain called a polymer, or in this case a lipid. On the tip end of this, there is a phosphate, so we call this a phosphate group. And this does something very interesting. This structure, which kind of looks like a head and a tail, kind of like a tadpole maybe, but this end right here actually has chemistry in it that makes it attracted to water, kind of like a magnet. So we call that hydrophilic, meaning that it loves water. So if you put it in water, the head will face towards the water molecule. And something really interesting happens back here. The chemistry of the tails is that it's kind of repelled to water. We call that hydrophobic. And you can very much think of this as having like a magnet, like a north and a south on a magnet. The north will face towards the water and the south will be pushed away from the water. It's a very similar process here. Now, if you just had one uh, phospholipid sitting in water, well, it's not going to know which way to point because it's going to be surrounded by water. But if you had a bunch of these, something really interesting can happen. You can create what we call a phospholipid bilayer. You can have some of them, two layers of phospholipids with the parts that don't like the water facing in and the parts that do like the water facing out, and you get this double layer with heads facing out and tails facing in. And on the outside, and this creates the cell membrane, as you can see here. Here's the heads and here's the tails inside. So now we got water on the inside of the cell, water on the outside of the cell, but now we have a structure that has heads facing towards the water, both inside and out, and the tails facing away from the water, and it orients itself to create a sphere entirely out of these things. And this is what the cell membrane is made out of. And this is actually unbelievably ingenious. It works so well that every single cell that has ever existed on Earth is made out of this, including all of your cells, all of your mom's cells, all of Justin Bieber's cells, all of a Tyrannosaurus Rex's cells, all of a bacteria cells. Every cell is made out of this, and it works quite well. And I just want to make sure that you notice that it is made out of a bunch of these little single what we call phospholipids. It's made out of a bunch of them all through the place. Now there's a lot more to it than this. But it is called a bilayer. Bi means two, so there's two layers, and they're oriented so that the heads face water, the inside and the outside of the cell, and the tails face towards the middle of this thing. Now this creates a very effective barrier that doesn't just let anything in, you know. In fact, it's very good at keeping most things out, and this is why we take the time to talk about the cell membrane all on its own, because the cell membrane is the geniusness of the cell. It controls what comes in and goes out of the cell, which regulates the cell metabolism. By being able to control what comes in and goes out, you can regulate everything about the cell. This is the most important organelle by far, and it's what makes all life on Earth possible. Okay, so the way that we do this is it's called selectively permeable. It controls what comes in and goes out of the cell. There are mechanisms here, there are structures in here, there's chemistry going on here that lets what it wants in, what it wants out. It keeps out what it doesn't want in, and it keeps in what it doesn't want out. It's called selectively permeable. Now, permeable means that some things can pass through it and some can't. The best example I've ever heard for a permeable membrane is like the screen on a window. You can open up a window and the screen is there for a reason. What does it let in that you want in? Yeah, air from the outside. What does it keep out that you don't want in? Bugs, right? And so as a result, that's a selectively permeable membrane. It lets in what you want in and it keeps out what you want out. The cell is the same way, except in this case it's things like food or water or waste particles or oxygen or carbon dioxide, or just, all kinds of stuff moves into and out of the cell. But if it could just wildly go in and wildly go out without any control, then the cell wouldn't be able to live for very long. Its metabolism wouldn't work. But by being able to control what comes in and goes out, now we have an ability to regulate the metabolism of each cell. And every cell in your body, every cell on Earth, does this very thing at various speeds and at various abilities. To make it happen over the billions of years of evolution, not only was there the cell membrane, but now there's things that get stuck into it that help move stuff in and out. You got things like proteins that stick in there and they help move things through certain things because of the way the chemistry works. In fact, you got a couple of proteins stick together and actually make a hole that opens and closes selectively. You got a carbohydrate chain that controls what comes in and goes out. And there's another thing with these carbohydrate chains I'll talk about real fast in just a second. But these cholesterol is important. Cholesterol is a requirement for the cell membrane. So when everybody says cholesterol is bad, well, what they really mean is too much cholesterol is bad, because you got to have some. Now the good news is you make it, so you don't have to eat it, but you have to have some cholesterol because it's an important part of the cell membrane, an important part of letting things come in and go out. Now, there's something interesting I want to show you right here. These are called antigens. These carbohydrate chains, in a few, well, actually, the next slide here, we're going to talk about it down here in just a minute. We're going to talk about how sticking on the outside of the cell, these are like identifiers. They're kind of like name tags, and so we're going to get to those in just a minute. All right. The channel proteins, that's this guy right here. The channel proteins, they help big stuff go into and out of the cell, and they act like kind of like an airlock. Or if you've ever gone in and out of Lake Okeechobee, they have a lock that allows, it lets things go in and out of the lake, and it's very much like that. It opens and closes depending on what needs to go in there. Um, so another, come on, stupid computer, stop. Goodness. So it opens and closes and allows things to come in and go out as needed, and it has rules. So it doesn't just let everything come in and go out. It only lets certain things come in and go out. The cholesterols provide strength to the cell membrane. It gives it this this extra added structure. I can't give you a really good example, but if you were building something and you threw extra pieces of metal in there to make it stronger, then that's what we're talking about. But it has it has a function. And the carbohydrates are really important because this is something that you guys will probably hear about one day in the future. But they act kind of like, well, in this case, they give you an example of a state flag. It kind of tells you what kind of cell this is. It's like I think of it better as being like a name badge instead of like these state flags. If I work at a school, Okeechobee High School, for example, they give me a name badge, and if I wear it, I should be able to walk onto the school and just say, "Oh, there's my name badge," right? And then they go, "Oh, hey, you're one of us. Okay, come on in." But suppose I were to go to, say, Martin County High School with my Okeechobee High School badge, would it work? No. They would go, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, you're not supposed to be here. What's going on?" And there would be a response. And these are called antigens, and they stick on the outside of cells, and they identify cells in many, many, many ways. I don't know if you know what your blood type is, but blood type is a great example. I'm O negative, which means I don't have anything on the outside of my cells. But there are people who are O positive, meaning they have a positive antigen. There are people who are B positive, meaning they have a B antigen and a positive antigen. There are people who are A positive. They have an A and A antigen and a positive. Anyway, they act like name tags. And in this case, you have two. You have the letter and the positive or negative, or you don't have any. And I don't have any, right? So that's how they work. And in fact, immune responses work this way as well, because your immune system is based around, if some kind of a cell gets into your body and it doesn't have the right antigens on the outside, your body goes, "Whoa, you're not supposed to be here, kill it." And that's how the immune system works. And so those are really important, and they're just these carbohydrate chains on the outside, but these little carbohydrate chains act like name tags, and they help us to identify whether or not a cell is supposed to be there or not. Um, so anyway, the main part of the cell membrane is made out of the phospholipid, and as I've told you already, it has a head that is focused towards water, whether that's water on the outside of the cell or the water on the inside of the cell, and the tails focus away. And this just gives you a better look of what it looks like. It gives you a better idea of how the cells go to, or how the phospholipids go together to make up a cell in the cell membrane. Um, it protects the cell from the outside environment by keeping stuff out that's not supposed to come in, and it controls what enters and exits the cell, and that makes it semi-permeable. And that's going to wrap this up. And I just wanted to kind of reiterate a couple of things. We talked about types of cells, prokaryotes and eukaryotes, and we also talked about the cell membrane in this video. The next video is going to talk about the rest of the organelles of the cell, and kind of the difference between plant and animal cells. But that's it for this. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in part 3.